The air inside the command tent was thick with smoke and exhaustion. It was early September 1944, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, stood silently over a map that stretched across the wooden table like a living organism, veins of red and blue lines marking the pulse of a dying war. Europe lay fractured before him. To the west, the Allies had broken free from the beaches of Normandy. To the east, the German army was bleeding but still dangerous. At that moment, the war in Europe hung by a thread, and that thread was about to be pulled by one man. Eisenhower's staff waited for him to speak. Bernard Montgomery, the brilliant yet infuriating British field marshal, had made his case loudly: drive a single massive spearhead straight through northern Germany, cross the Rhine, and end the war before Christmas. Concentrate our power, Montgomery urged. Strike hard, strike narrow, and Berlin will fall. Across the tent, American generals like Omar Bradley and George S. Patton bristled. A narrow front meant giving Montgomery command over most Allied resources and sidelining the Americans who had bled across France. Eisenhower listened quietly, his eyes steady. He was not just commanding armies, he was balancing egos, nations, and the fragile alliance that held the free world together. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but final. "We will advance on a broad front," he said. "No single nation will decide the fate of Europe alone." That decision, dismissed by some as cautious, praised by others as visionary, would shape the final act of World War II. It slowed the race to Berlin, frustrated his subordinates, and perhaps saved the unity of the Allies. Eisenhower's broad front wasn't just a military tactic. It was a political gamble, a statement about how to win a war, not by lightning strikes and personal glory, but by holding together the most fragile coalition in human history. A decision that, 8 decades later, still divides historians and defines leadership itself. At its core, the broad front versus narrow front debate was never just about geography or tactics. It was about philosophy. In 1944, as Allied armies surged out of Normandy and raced toward Germany, Eisenhower faced a choice that would reveal the essence of his command style. Should he gamble everything on one decisive thrust, or spread his forces to maintain relentless pressure across the entire Western Front? Field Marshal Montgomery argued for concentration, the narrow front. He envisioned a swift surgical strike northward through the Ruhr, capturing the industrial heart of Germany and perhaps ending the war before winter. Eisenhower, however, believed that the key to victory lay in balance and coordination, not daring gambles. His broad front meant advancing simultaneously along a wide axis, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, preventing the Germans from regrouping and ensuring every Allied nation shared in the march to liberation. This wasn't just a military argument, it was a political one. Eisenhower's decision embodied his faith in coalition warfare. That unity among allies was more important than any single general's glory. In choosing the broad front, he set a precedent: leadership rooted not in ego, but in equilibrium. Dwight David Eisenhower was not born into privilege or legacy. He came from the flat, wind-swept plains of Abilene, Kansas, a modest town that carved humility and endurance into his character. The son of a mechanic and a devout mother, young Ike grew up learning the virtues of patience, discipline, and quiet strength. He was never the loudest voice in the room, but he was the one everyone eventually turned to when things went wrong. When Eisenhower entered West Point in 1911, he was a decent student, but an exceptional organizer. What set him apart wasn't aggression, but his ability to coordinate, to see patterns where others saw chaos. Ironically, he never saw combat in World War I, a disappointment that haunted him for years. But that absence gave him something many frontline generals lacked: perspective. He spent those years learning logistics, strategy, and the art of managing men who didn't always agree. Through the interwar years, Eisenhower's steady competence earned him mentors like General Fox Connor and Douglas MacArthur. Connor, a philosopher in uniform, drilled into him a crucial lesson: never fight unless you have to, never fight alone, and never fight for long. That triad would define Eisenhower's thinking decades later in Europe. Under MacArthur, however, he saw the other side of command: ambition, vanity, and the corrosive effects of ego on leadership. It was a masterclass in both excellence and excess. Eisenhower learned that true power wasn't in shouting orders, but in persuading others to follow them. By the time America entered World War II, Eisenhower was the embodiment of organized restraint. He rose quickly, first commanding in North Africa, then Sicily, and finally taking the supreme Allied command for the invasion of France. He wasn't chosen because he was the boldest or most decorated, but because he could make the impossible coalition work. Roosevelt and Churchill trusted him for one reason: he could hold together men who otherwise would tear each other apart. When D-Day came, Eisenhower didn't lead the charge with a pistol in hand. He led with conviction, coordination, and a willingness to bear the weight of every decision. The broad front that would later define his legacy wasn't born in the heat of war. It was shaped in the quiet classrooms of West Point and the windy fields of Kansas, where Ike learned that patience often wins where pride destroys. By 1943, Dwight Eisenhower had become something of an enigma within the Allied hierarchy. Not the most flamboyant, not the most famous, yet somehow the indispensable center of gravity. His rise from an obscure staff officer to Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force was less a meteoric climb than a careful accumulation of trust. Both Roosevelt and Churchill recognized something in Ike that few generals possessed. He could lead without alienating. In a war fought by egos as much as armies, that was rare currency. The politics of command during World War II were treacherous. The British, whose empire still carried imperial pride, expected to lead. The Americans, providing the bulk of men and material, demanded their turn at the helm. Eisenhower, standing at the intersection of those ambitions, became a diplomat in uniform. His command was less about giving orders than managing personalities. Montgomery's obsession with control, Patton's volatile brilliance, Bradley's quiet pragmatism, Churchill's restless interference, and Roosevelt's cautious idealism. The North African campaign had tested him. The Italian campaign had matured him. But it was in the run-up to D-Day that Eisenhower truly forged his authority. Operation Overlord was not just a military invasion. It was the largest cooperative undertaking in human history. Planning it required not only strategy, but a kind of psychological diplomacy that few military men could master. Eisenhower had to coordinate the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy, the RAF and the U.S. Army Air Forces, the armies of 5 nations, and the political wills of 2 continents. When the invasion succeeded, the world cheered the soldiers on the beaches. But within the command circles, a more complex reality emerged. Victory created its own crisis. Each general now wanted to shape how the war would end. Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group, pushed hard for his narrow front vision, a single concentrated push through northern Germany under his leadership. Patton, meanwhile, dreamed of sweeping across southern Germany and claiming glory for the U.S. Third Army. Eisenhower was caught in the middle, not as a bystander, but as the referee of history. Every decision he made now had political as well as military weight. Roosevelt wanted quick victory, Churchill wanted prestige, Stalin was pressing from the east. The Supreme Commander's role had evolved into something far beyond battlefield tactics. He was, in effect, the first Allied politician general, a man who had to win a war while preserving the unity of nations that barely trusted one another. That balance, between ambition and alliance, would define Eisenhower's next great test, choosing between speed and solidarity, between the promise of Berlin and the principle of partnership. And in that choice, the fate of post-war Europe quietly began to take shape. September 1944. The Allies were moving faster than anyone had predicted. After the breakout from Normandy and Operation Cobra, German defenses in France had collapsed. Paris was liberated, Antwerp was captured, and Patton's Third Army had raced more than 600 miles in a matter of weeks. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed as if the war might be over by Christmas. But momentum, Eisenhower knew, could be both a gift and a trap. Armies were running out of fuel, supply lines stretched thin over devastated French roads, and the weather was turning. Germany was wounded, but not finished. Its armies retreating toward the Rhine to form a final defensive wall. And it was there, on the edge of the German heartland, that the great Allied debate ignited. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the northern sector, argued passionately that the Allies should deliver one decisive blow. Concentrate all resources, fuel, divisions, air power, into a single spearhead north through the Ruhr, crossing the Rhine at Arnhem, and driving straight into Berlin. He promised a knockout blow. The plan would become known as Operation Market Garden. Montgomery's confidence was intoxicating, and Churchill supported him eagerly, seeing in the plan a chance for Britain to claim the final triumph. Across the command table, Eisenhower listened. His face was expressionless, his hands clasped behind his back. To him, Montgomery's plan was daring but reckless, a gamble that risked catastrophe if even one part went wrong. "We cannot gamble with the war," Eisenhower later told his staff. His instinct was shaped not by glory, but by logistics and politics. The Allied armies, he argued, must advance on a broad front, a steady, unified push across a line stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. It would be slower, but it would keep the Germans off balance everywhere, prevent a concentrated counterattack, and ensure that no single nation dominated the advance. Montgomery bristled. Patton fumed. Both men accused Eisenhower of lacking aggressiveness. Yet Ike held firm. "No one nation," he reminded them, "is winning this war alone." When Operation Market Garden launched in September, Eisenhower permitted it, but as a limited offensive, not the central thrust. The result vindicated his caution. Within days, the daring airborne assault collapsed under German counterfire. The Rhine wasn't crossed, Arnhem was lost. Thousands of Allied paratroopers were killed or captured. The dream of ending the war before Christmas evaporated in the mist of northern Holland. Eisenhower's broad front resumed. Deliberate, methodical, relentless. The Allies advanced inch by inch, liberating Belgium and Luxembourg, tightening the noose around Germany from every side. It was slower, yes, but devastatingly effective. By dispersing the German defenses, the Allies denied Hitler the chance to concentrate his reserves. Still, the critics grew louder. Churchill wrote in his diary that Eisenhower lacked the gambler's soul. Montgomery, in private letters, called his commander a nice fellow, but no general. Yet Eisenhower ignored the noise. He knew that his mission was larger than his own reputation. He wasn't trying to win fast, he was trying to win right. And when, in December 1944, the Germans launched their desperate counterattack in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower's logic proved prophetic. Because the Allies had maintained a broad front, they had reserves on every flank. The German thrust was absorbed, contained, and crushed. The broad front had done more than win battles. It had preserved the alliance, a coalition fragile enough to break under the weight of any single ego. Eisenhower's restraint, once mocked as indecision, had quietly saved the unity that made victory possible. History would later debate whether Eisenhower's strategy delayed the end of the war. But few would deny that it defined how the West and the modern world would learn to fight. Not through domination, but through cooperation. Eisenhower's broad front strategy has long stood as one of the most scrutinized and misunderstood decisions of World War II. To some, it was the epitome of cautious leadership, measured, predictable, even timid. To others, it was the masterstroke of a man who understood that wars are not won by daring alone, but by balance, endurance, and diplomacy. From a purely military standpoint, the advantages of the broad front were rooted in logistics and unity. Eisenhower understood the fundamental truth of modern war. No army moves faster than its supply line. By September 1944, Allied forces were consuming nearly 30 million gallons of fuel a day. A narrow, deep thrust like Montgomery proposed would have concentrated that demand into a single corridor, dependent on one fragile lifeline. A single German counterattack could have severed it, trapping tens of thousands of men far ahead of support. The broad front, by contrast, ensured flexibility. If one sector stalled, others could advance. The Allies would never risk total paralysis. But the military logic was only half the story. The deeper reason for Eisenhower's decision lay in politics. The Allied command was not a single army. It was a collection of sovereign nations with their own ambitions, casualties, and leaders back home demanding recognition. If Eisenhower had handed control of the main thrust to Montgomery, or to Patton for that matter, he would have jeopardized the delicate balance between the British and the Americans, perhaps even fracturing the alliance that made victory possible. The broad front was a statement of principle. This war would be won together, or not at all. The results bore out both the strengths and weaknesses of his choice. On the positive side, the Allies advanced steadily and methodically, liberating most of Western Europe with minimal internal friction. no single general dominated the narrative, and the Germans, forced to defend everywhere, could not mass their forces effectively. The strategy also laid the groundwork for the post-war stability of Western Europe, where cooperation, not unilateral dominance, became the cornerstone of the peace. Yet the criticisms remain valid. The broad front was slower, costlier, and less decisive than it might have been. Some historians, such as Chester Wilmot and Max Hastings, have argued that Eisenhower's caution prolonged the war by months, allowing the Soviet Union to reach Berlin first, and thereby shape Eastern Europe's fate for the next half-century. Others, like Stephen Ambrose and John Keegan, counter that the alternative might have been catastrophic, a failed thrust that split the Allies and gave Hitler a political lifeline. In the end, Eisenhower's choice was less about victory and more about control of the battlefield, of the coalition, of history itself. His genius was not tactical brilliance, but moral and strategic restraint. Knowing when not to gamble, when to let the weight of unity crush the enemy rather than the ego of a single man. It was a lesson the world would come to appreciate only in hindsight, when the guns fell silent and the map of Europe was redrawn, not by one conqueror, but by a coalition that refused to fall apart. If victory has many fathers, Eisenhower's broad front victory had almost as many critics. The debate began before the Rhine was even crossed. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, ever confident, accused his American commander of squandering an opportunity for rapid triumph. A single concentrated thrust, he wrote later, would have ended the war months earlier and spared countless lives. In private correspondence with Churchill, he went further, lamenting that Eisenhower preferred diplomacy to decision. Churchill, torn between admiration and impatience, shared some of Montgomery's frustration. To him, the broad front felt slow, almost bureaucratic, an approach unsuited to a moment when speed could have rewritten history. He feared that Eisenhower's restraint might allow Stalin's Red Army to seize Berlin first, and indeed it did. For Churchill, this was not merely strategic disappointment, it was a geopolitical tragedy. Eisenhower's American critics were no less vocal. General George S. Patton derided the strategy as a banker's war. Too much caution, not enough courage. Omar Bradley, while more diplomatic, quietly admitted that Ike's decisions sometimes prioritized politics over battlefield efficiency. To soldiers bleeding in the mud of the Hurtgen Forest or the snows of the Ardennes, broad front felt like a synonym for no end in sight. The post-war years deepened the divide. British historians tended to cast Montgomery as the bold visionary and Eisenhower as the cautious bureaucrat. American scholars, by contrast, celebrated Ike as the ultimate coalition commander, the steady hand who kept Allied unity intact. Over time, even some of his critics conceded that his political acumen may have been as crucial as any military maneuver. The controversy resurfaced in the 1950s, when Eisenhower became President of the United States. His wartime methods were mirrored in his Cold War policies: gradual containment, careful alliances, deliberate restraint. Detractors accused him again of doing too little, too late. Supporters called it wisdom, a refusal to let ego or ideology ignite another global fire. Today, the argument endures in military academies and history books. Was the broad front a cautious compromise or a stroke of strategic genius? Perhaps both. But one fact remains undisputed. Eisenhower won not just a war, but the peace that followed. And in an era when many sought glory, he chose endurance, the kind of victory that leaves no parades but builds the world that comes after. Dwight D. Eisenhower's broad front strategy outlived the war that gave birth to it. In the years that followed, as the world transitioned from open conflict to cold tension, the logic behind his wartime choices became the architecture of a new geopolitical order. The same instincts that guided him across Europe, restraint, balance, and coalition, would later shape his presidency and the Western alliance itself. When he entered the White House in 1953, Eisenhower applied the same strategic principles he had once mapped on the fields of France. The doctrine of containment in the Cold War mirrored his wartime philosophy: pressure the enemy across every front, political, economic, ideological, but never risk the entire balance on one reckless move. Just as he had refused to let Montgomery or Patton turn the European war into a personal crusade, he now resisted those in Washington who urged preemptive nuclear strikes or aggressive confrontation with the Soviet Union. His broad front became global: NATO, SEATO, and a network of partnerships designed to distribute responsibility, not centralize it. But the lesson of Eisenhower's command went deeper than geopolitics. It was a meditation on leadership itself. In an age that glorified audacity, he embodied moderation. Where others sought headlines, he sought harmony. He understood that true power often lies not in the boldest stroke, but in the quiet discipline to hold a coalition or a nation together under unbearable strain. Historians now see in Eisenhower's wartime decisions the blueprint for modern alliance warfare: multinational command structures, shared logistics, and the primacy of political unity over individual heroism. NATO's success in maintaining peace through collective defense owes much to the principles forged under Eisenhower's wartime leadership. Even today, military academies study his strategy not as relic, but as foundation, proof that patience and partnership can sometimes achieve what brute force cannot. Yet his legacy carries a subtle irony. The very restraint that preserved the alliance also denied him the glory that history reserves for bold conquerors. There was no dramatic march on Berlin, no triumphant photograph of Ike accepting Germany's surrender. His victory was quieter, the kind that echoes through decades rather than headlines. Eisenhower's broad front was, in the end, not just a path to victory, but a philosophy of order, a belief that peace must be built the same way wars are won, together, or not at all. History rarely remembers the calm hands, only the clenched fists. Yet in the great storm of World War II, Dwight D. Eisenhower proved that calmness, discipline, and patience could be as decisive as any blitzkrieg. He fought not to conquer, but to coordinate, not to outshine, but to outlast. His decision to advance on a broad front, derided by some as slow and bureaucratic, ultimately became one of the defining acts of modern strategic leadership. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Eisenhower did not stand atop the ruins of Berlin. He stood beside his allies, British, French, Canadian, and American, each having earned a share of the victory. The symbolism was deliberate. Eisenhower had refused to let the war end as a contest of egos. He ensured it ended as a testament to unity. In hindsight, his broad front was less about the direction of armies than about